Happy Monday, everyone. Welcome inside the Hockey Hub. Friend of the show, Judd Sirott, back for whatever episode this is, 80-something, I think.
84.
Welcome. 84. You know better than I do. The last time, Judd, you and I were on the show together, we've obviously seen each other since. I had oven problems. Do you remember that? The beeping, the consistent beeping that was going on.
What are you making today?
No oven problems today. No, nothing. I have a couple of I have two, actually. I'm not going to hold them both up, but a couple of coffees. What do you got? What do you got over there?
I got the iced coffee right here.
Here's my other one. And
I
even have a tea. Oh, that's way too strong for me, dude. I could not. I know you call me the Hurricane. So actually, Judd, did you start that nickname, the Hurricane? Or did Z?
I don't know. I don't know who's going to take credit for it, but you can ask Z. That's our executive producer, Brian Zachello. I think I had mentioned that because you had all this stuff going on all at once. So it was, yes. You're like a hurricane. It's Hurricane Sophia.
It is, and you keep it alive and well, and I actually love it. Every time you see me, you say hurricane.
Hurricane!
But if you were to, this shot is set up nicely, but behind there is a hurricane. So anyway, hurricaning my way into Monday. Judd, so glad to have you on because it's the middle of the summer, dog days of the hockey season, or the non-existent season, but we really haven't gotten your thoughts on this show as to all the transactions that have happened since the end of the season, and there have been many. And you and I were having our pregame meeting with our producer Brendan, where we wanted to take it, and we're just gonna kind of get your thoughts. So why don't I don't like throwing out a general lob, but one of the big question marks, and we've had other guests on the show that we want to talk about, is training camp and what that's going to look like. And right before I get your thoughts, of course, I forgot to mention who our guest is. And we're going to have someone from the Boston Herald, Okie, as we like to call him, but Steve Conroy, one of the most faithful, always at every morning skate, always at every practice, participating in all the questions on the road. But Steve Conroy, you guys know him well from following the Boston Bruins. He'll be on in about 20 minutes. But before we get his thoughts, let's start with you and wherever you want to take it. But let's start with training camp. You and I were saying might be the most interesting one in a couple of years.
Well, just thinking about it in the big picture, and I was just trying to do, math is not my strong suit, but Sophia, we're about 6 or 7 weeks away from the start of training camp here for the Boston Bruins. So you start to think about, okay, what are some of the storylines ahead for this team? And to me, if you think about this team, where they're at, some of the moves that they've made, the draft that they went through, some of the comments that have been made by the general manager, Don Sweeney, I think that there are so many intriguing storylines when it comes to the Bruins, whether that's individual players or the team as a whole. And maybe the only guy who you don't have an intriguing storyline around because you don't have any doubts about the way he's going to perform is a guy like David Pastrnak, who last year in many ways should have been a contender for the Hart Trophy in the National Hockey League based on the definition of it. And it's most valuable player to your team, considering what he was able to produce and how he was able to produce, considering they were a one-line team. They were out of the playoffs. There was basically one line you needed to shut down, and one guy in particular, and he continued to score. But the Bruins in general as a whole, they went through a great draft. I think for them, they needed to replenish some of the skill and some of the depth in the organization. That's one of the things that they talked about. But I also started to think about some of the comments that the general manager, Don Sweeney, had made at the end of the season, maybe even before the season ended, and then leading into the draft. And one of the things that he had talked about was we looked at the opportunities in front of us to change the direction of things without tearing things down. And I think that that's what the Bruins wanted to make clear, that this wasn't a total down-to-the-studs rebuild. They were going to keep key pieces in place. David Pastrnak, Charlie McAvoy, Hampus Lindholm's going to be back. Jeremy Swayman is still there. Elias Lindholm starting his second season along with Nikita Zadorov. And there were other guys on the roster. So I think when he looked at the group, he felt like they were in neutral. They weren't moving forward. They weren't progressing. So this was a way for him to tear some of the pieces down, leave some of the key pillars that are still in the organization, and see how they can build it back. And we can start with the draft and getting a guy like James Higgins, who you can upgrade the skill. And maybe that's a good conversation that we can start, just you and I. because sometimes it takes a while, even for a high draft pick, to make the impact that you want in your organization.
Yeah, honestly, Judd, we can take it so many places. I definitely want to talk about James Higgins, but when you mentioned that on the call, that we or fans or management probably has a question mark around everyone except for David Pastrnak 88. I really thought about that. I was going through the roster in my head there. I was like, you're absolutely right. Like there is not doubt in the negative sense, but question marks around if Morgan Geekie's going to keep up or be better, or if he's going to take a slide down in terms of performance. Pavel Zacha, how's he going to be? He's been kind of like hot and cold. Injuries, health. Mason Laura, is he going to make that jump? Charlie McAvoy. There are so many question marks, and you're so right. And when I run into fans here, Bruins fans in Boston, and there are so many, and every time I get a chance to talk to them, I love it. But they are always asking, like, what do you think? Are we okay? What's going to happen? I always say if even 3 or 4 players got 50% better, and that's a lot, but let's say healthier, if there was even the health, and we saw just a small percentage of improvement in a couple of players last season, I'm not saying it would have been a completely different team, but even that is going to be some help, and we're of course expecting for a lot more than just a couple players to step it up. So even if you're getting Jeremy Swayman back on his game, if Charlie McAvoy wasn't injured and was able to contribute, if Hampus Lindholm, if Elias Lindholm started having or had a season like he started having at the end a lot earlier, then you're looking at least a different, not an outcome, maybe the playoffs wouldn't have happened, but just things would be different. And that's like the bare minimum that we're expecting to happen. Now you have these new additions. So I don't feel like it's doom and gloom, but of course, and a lot of the fans are kind of saying like, oh, we're not going to make the postseason. Yeah, maybe not for a year, but there's so much potential on this roster. But of course, it could go either way, right? There was potential with the acquisitions that with Zadorov and Elias Lindholm, and they didn't go as expected. So we'll just have to see. But I just think there's a lot of hope. Like this isn't a complete, like you said, tear down and we're going to miss the playoffs for a couple seasons. Like if even a couple of those players start playing to their level of expectation, we're looking at a much better outcome this season.
Well, that's certainly what you hope for. There was a general manager who's still in the league who had mentioned, this was a long time ago, that he had said just because you bring back the same players, you don't necessarily get the same result. And that can be good or bad. Mm-hmm. But that's one of the things to think about when coming to this team. But I'll throw it out to you because one of the things that came to my mind, and we had mentioned this a little bit in our production meeting, what's the biggest storyline for the Bruins 6 weeks from now when they start, 6 or 7 weeks from now when they start training camp? What is the biggest story for the team? I'll throw it out to you.
Yeah, I mean, the thing, I feel like there hasn't been, like, Judd, there are so many headlines. New coach, no captain, reviving this culture that hasn't exactly, gone away, but, took a tumble for sure. Youth, like is the trade for Brandon Carlo, Fraser Minton, is that going to work out? Matt Poitras, how's he going to look after,
I'm running out of fingers.
You're counting, exactly. Fabian Lysell, that's a big one that, we've been sitting on for a long time. He got a bit of consistent play at the end of the season. Is Jeremy Swayman going to be the Jeremy Swayman that signed that massive contract? Who's going to be the backup? Like there are so many angles. And then, of course, free agency, the pieces you acquired. What is that going to look like? For me, a huge one is Elias Lindholm and Pavel Zacha. I want to see more from them to beef up the top six. But I don't know. Like, is there the biggest storyline? Is there one in your mind?
Probably right at the top, and it's something that Brick has talked a lot about, and I know you've mentioned it too as well, Sophia, that how do you rebuild back the culture? Because if you think about it, the last remaining piece of that culture from the 2011 team was Brad Marchand. So there's nobody left. Mm-hmm. So how do you build that back? And you had mentioned that there's no captain, and we can certainly discuss whether you think that there's going to be someone who wears the C this year. I don't know if necessarily that's going to take place, and Marco Sturm was asked about it if he needs to have a captain, and it sounded like he demurred on the whole topic. So it wouldn't surprise me if the Bruins go without a captain. But how do you reestablish that? And I think that one of the things that the GM Don Sweeney had recognized is, yes, they understand that they've made some sizable changes to the core group. So what does it look like now? Because for about more than a decade, the Bruins and their culture was the envy of the National Hockey League. So how do you either recapture that or form it in a similar way that you can get some similar results? So what does that look like with the veterans who are now remaining? David Pastrnak did a tremendous job, I thought, leading by example after the trade of Brad Marchand, and he did it by the way he played, by the way he practiced, and talking to guys as you did as well with so many guys in the room, just how much that he offered behind the scenes to help a lot of the players. Does that mean that he has to be the captain? Not necessarily, but who also helps him to be able to do that? I think the first thing that we're probably going to talk about is a guy like Charlie McAvoy, but how do you reform what was the envy of the National Hockey League, and from that, because that's essentially your foundation, and then start to win again? And to me, the second biggest story for this team was maybe the biggest mystery of last season. They have to be able to defend again. That was their identity. It's not necessarily about toughness, and yes, it's a part of it, but it was about being a stingy team. And I think that, I don't know how you felt, but I think that was the biggest surprise for me. I don't know that I necessarily thought that the Bruins were going to be a prolific offensive team. I think you were hoping that they were going to be able to score goals, and the power play that we talked about ad nauseum last year was a disappointment. But they had a hard time defending. And other than maybe 1 month after the coaching change last year, they just couldn't seem to be able to recapture that. So to me, that's the second biggest storyline. And it would seem to me, assuming that you're healthy, that a lot of those pieces are there. You talked about improvement. Jeremy Swayman, I would expect that he's going to be a lot better than he was last year because he's going to go through a full training camp, because he doesn't have a contract negotiation hanging over his head. And I think if the Bruins are able to start to reestablish some of that leadership group, some of that core, and start to defend, then to your point, talking about the Bruins with fans as you walk around here in Boston or here in New England, then I think they have a chance to at least make things interesting late in the season.
Yeah. You know what? I in terms of just captaincy and leadership, I don't think there's going to be a rush. Like, I know at the start of a couple seasons ago, management announced Brad Marchand before the start of the season. Marco Sturm made it clear that he's heard a lot about Charlie McAvoy, David Pastrnak, but he doesn't know them. So he's like, we're going to see what, I heard they're great leaders, but let's see. So I don't think there's going to be any rush there. To your point about how David Pastrnak led the team on the ice and in the locker room, absolutely. And as someone who had a chance, when I came back from my leave, I was kind of reporting for a little bit to get my feet wet. So I was around the room a lot more than I am when I'm hosting. And for me, I had this gap. I had the summer, that was a gap. And then I had this gap of like 6 or 7 months where I hadn't spoken to David Pastrnak. And in that, let's call it a full year almost, I was like, oh my God, like he's different. He is different in this room. And maybe especially, I started right after the trade deadline. So, Marchand was gone. Maybe he took a bigger jump even after the trade deadline. But what David Pastrnak used to be like, and that was also because Bergeron and Chara and Marchand would step up, and Nick Foligno would step up and answer the questions when the Bruins were kind of in a slump or not playing their best. He was kind of he would come out and he would be requested and he would do his due diligence. But what I was noticing is he would volunteer. Like, he's like, I'm talking to the media. I'm coming in. He wouldn't rush. He wasn't like, okay, are we done these scrums? He would get asked the same question over and over again from away reporters or whatever. And he had this patience and almost like this fatherly protection figure of being like, I'm the guy. If you have questions about what's going on and I know it's not looking good right now, come talk to me. Charlie McAvoy didn't have a chance to do that because he wasn't playing. And so I don't know how he would have handled it, but I really saw that from David Pastrnak. And I'll say really quick, in the end of season pressers, Charlie McAvoy did get to come out and talk. And I've already said this on the show, but I was in awe about what I saw in him too. And there was this absolute, this frustration and this fire inside of being like, it's like quicksand. It can slip so quickly. Like he came into this room when it was fantastic and the record-setting season, and like he's not saying it's been an easy run, but he's had a good time with the Boston Bruins, and then all of a sudden it just slips so quickly, and you can tell that he was like, absolutely not. Like, I will do everything in my power to make sure this doesn't fall apart and to instill or install whatever he learned. And he said that they were immediately, this was at locker cleanout, already in communication with Chara, with Patrice Bergeron, on how to do that. And not, I just want to be clear, not in the sense that, oh, I need your help, like help me. They're capable, but more just guidance. Can you guide us into, what we need to do to the new players that come in, whether it's phone calls or taking them out for lunch or making sure their kids or their partners are taken care of, XYZ. So I feel very confident that those two guys, it's going to be an uphill battle, but they are taking this more seriously, or just as seriously as the play on the ice. So I'm excited about that and how that shapes out. As for the defensive side of the game, we had Paige Capistran on last week. She, former NSO employee, former Boston Pride player, and now is broadcasting for the Ontario Reign. So she had a year, maybe two, but she had a year with Marco Sturm. And she was talking about how awesome he was with her. When she had questions about the game, they'd sit down and talk. He'd help her with her broadcast. But he was very, very preachy on how defense and how he needs his teams to be very, very strong defensively, and that's going to be his key in what he needs to get out of the Bruins as well. And so that's going to be a huge focus of his. So I'm very encouraged by that. And we'll see how those two things get addressed.
Well, obviously he's got a lot on his plate when it comes to his first season as a National Hockey League head coach. But Sophia, I wanted to sort of circle back when you were talking about Brad Marchand and Charlie McAvoy, and maybe just reach back just a tad into the season that we just wrapped up. That I think there were so many issues that were revolving around the Bruins, and part of it was that a guy like Brad Marchand needed a little bit of help around that leadership core. But I think the other thing that made it difficult for a lot of people to help around there is that it's hard to help when your game is not necessarily in order. It's hard to lead. And even a guy like Brad Marchand had talked about it. If you remember, now he was coming off at 3 surgeries, but let's just use him as an example. And I remember sitting down for a conversation with him in Dallas talking about this, and he talked about how difficult it is for you to lead or be a captain when your game is not where it needs to be. And I think that was part of an issue that cropped up for the Bruins last season. How does it present itself this year? Okay, we haven't really established, well, who is that centerpiece? I don't know if there's going to be, I think we talked about it. There's not necessarily going to be a captain. There could be, but I don't know if there's necessarily going to be. So who are the 3 people, 4 people, 5 people, and who's that secondary tier of leadership that's going to help that group along? And I think that they're going to have to do it by committee until something or someone emerges at this point. And as far as how to defend, I think if the Bruins are able to do that, again, they're going to be in every single game. They have a lot of the personnel in place that will allow them to do that. I think Jeremy Swayman's going to be better. The D-core, assuming that they're healthy, they should be better. I think one of the things that's going to help, and one of the things that maybe we can talk about when it comes to Marco Sturm, whether it's systematically or what he's saying to these players behind the scenes or on the bench, is that the Bruins need to have the puck more. That's an issue for them. Fine. If you want to dump it in, where are you dumping it in? Are you dumping it into a spot where you can get it? Now you've got some personnel that can maybe do that. I think one of the things, just to kind of back up a little bit and talk about some of the offseason moves, I think one of the things that Donnie Sweeney has talked about, whether it's this offseason or last offseason, is that he wanted the Bruins to be a better forechecking team. Okay, well, you have to be able to put pucks in spots where you can get them, and then you have to win battles to get them back. Does some of the personnel that they brought in, whether that's Tanner Jadot or Mikey Asimont or Sean Corrali, Victor Arvidsson to some extent, did those guys help you be able to do that? Yes, in theory. But I think if the Bruins are going to be able to, if they wanted to defend better, they have to have the puck more often, and that will be a key for a guy like Marco Sturm. And yes, if you have the puck more often, you're going to have better opportunities to score, but you're also going to be more adept defensively. He's got a lot that he's got on his plate, whether it's how they play or what it's like behind the scenes.
Honestly, Judd, listen, I have good news and bad news. The good news is we have an entire show to dive into this because I want to respond, but my response isn't short enough before we need to send it to break. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to send it to break. We have Steve Conroy coming up, but pause that thought because I have a lot to say about it. And you brought up a little earlier, James Higgins. I really want to address the youth. Like, I want to talk about Fraser Minton, James Higgins, Matt Poitras, Fabian Lysell. Like, I really want to dive into that because you can go either way. And I'm glad I'm not making these decisions, let's just say. But we'll get your thoughts. We'll continue to talk about this Bruins upcoming season and what was in the off season. But we got to send it to break, and we'll be right back with more after this. And welcome back to the Hockey Hub. Judd and I had to pause our conversation and thoughts on this Bruins training camp this season that was, because we have Steve Conroy waiting in the queue. We're just setting up a shot. He was a little upside down for a second there, Judd, but we'll bring him in. So we'll bring him in shortly. But Steve Conroy, writer of the Boston Herald, he had a great article that discussed goalies, and that's something that's obviously one of the, when you were counting, one of the big topics, one of the big storylines with the Boston Bruins. So we'll get to that with him whenever we are ready with that. But Judd, like I said, there are just so many directions that we can take this conversation, this whole podcast, and I'm just glad to have you back after not being on the show for hiatus to get your thoughts. So Steve Conroy is ready. Steve, welcome on to the show, the Hockey Hub. You are perfectly aligned. Perfect. You're not upside down anymore on the camera. But for those fans who may not know his face, you definitely have read his words in the Boston Herald. And you had an article come out recently about the goalie situation. So we're going to talk to you about that. But I wanted to start just by also giving a bit of a behind the scenes. Fans who watch the press conferences, who watch morning skate or practices may not know this, but you're always the first guy to ask a question. And if nobody asks about the goalie situation, you're the guy to make sure to get that question in. Is that an undue pressure at this point? Because it feels like it feels like it's your title right now. Do you feel the pressure?
Glasses down.
I don't know how that develops, but I guess people just wait for me to ask the first question. I don't know how it developed, but it has turned into something, I guess.
It did. Everyone's silent, whoever the coach is. When it was Bruce Cassidy, they're all looking around, but we all just wait for you, and then you kick things off. So people need to know that you're starting off every scrum with the hard-hitting journalism, and then, again, asking about goalies. But you're here with us now, and let's just start with, your general thoughts on the direction of this team after all the moves that have been made in the summer.
Yeah, I mean, I think, some people have already said this, but I think it's the moves they made. They weren't able to, hire, three different, top six, forwards. They just couldn't afford to do that. So what they did, at least what they've tried to do, is to address the competitiveness of the team that, had kind of gone on hiatus a little bit last year. And you saw it with blowout losses and, giving up goals in bunches. And, that just wasn't, Bruins hockey. So they added guys like not only Tanner Jeannot, who's who drops the gloves, but also competitive guys like Mikey Isamont and Sean Corrali, who we all know.
So before we go further, your nickname is Okie. So, I apologize. I'm going to end up calling you Okie instead of Steve Conroy, or Steve at this point. But Okie, when it comes to, I guess let's go individual players. Because, as Sophia and I were talking about before you came on, there's so many intriguing storylines surrounding just about everybody except a guy like David Pastrnak. Which player presents the biggest story heading into training camp for the Bruins and really the season?
Well, I guess it starts where all hockey starts. It starts in the net because, they've missed the playoffs, I think, 3 times in the past 18 years. And each of those years, goalie was a big story. 2 years when they missed it back to back, they didn't have the a competent backup for Tuukka Rask, and they end up missing the playoffs in the last week of the season both those years. And last year, of course, Swayman, started late and never really, found his game. So that starts there. Another place I think is going to be interesting is Mason Lohrei. Hopefully, if everybody stays healthy, he's going to be slotted, where he's supposed to be slotted on that third pairing, and he'll see some times when he'll be bumped up in the lineup when they need a goal. But he won't have to face top line pairings or second line pairings the way he did last year. Where else? We'll see where Elias Lindholm's game is. In retrospect, you can tell that he had a back injury to start last season because he was very, slow to join the battle. He did not play like he had played when he was at his best with Calgary. But he improved as the year went on. And we'll see where his game is, if he can be that top line center in between Pastrnak and Morgan Geekie.
But, Oki, one of the names that you did not mention was a guy like Charlie McAvoy. And some of the quotes, I want to get to one of the quotes that he had mentioned, and it was right after he started to make his first public comments coming back from the shoulder injury and the infection, and obviously he never even finished the season after the Four Nations tournament. And he talked about that injury. It cost me my sanity in a lot of ways. But when it comes to the leadership group, and you talk about, Jeremy Swayman, obviously it's a really apropos point when it comes to the way this team defends. Isn't a guy like Charlie McAvoy, when it comes to the way they defend and the foundational core of this team and what the leadership is like, wouldn't he be the biggest story?
Well, he's one of them. I will stick with Swayman as the biggest story. Okay, when your $8 million goalie is sub 900 save percentage, I think that's where you focus on right now. But yeah, I mean, all these guys, Hampus Lindholm, he's basically missed the entire season since November with a knee injury, and he had a fairly major setback that cost him the season. That's a big story. They're all over this roster.
Well, I want to take it a step further, Sophia, if you don't mind, because the other thing that gets talked about a lot, and the Bruins are going to be challenged, I think, to score offensively, but one of the areas that they were really hoping to improve was the power play. That's part of the reason that they brought on Steve Spott as a veteran assistant to help a guy like Marco Sturm in his first season as a National Hockey League head coach. But you would expect, I would think, Charlie McAvoy is going to be that defenseman on the number one power play unit, or he's going to get the first crack at it. And if that power play unit is going to be more successful, he has to be an integral part of that.
Yes, no question about it. And part of that is something that people have harped on his whole career, which is to be more shot ready. He's a little hesitant to let it go. There were times last year where he did try to shoot more, and we'll see if the Bruins as a whole will be more. We'll look for a little more quantity over quality as opposed to quality over quantity, because that was a big deal with this team last year and in the last couple of years.
Yeah, that was a very big storyline, and I believe Marco Sturm addressed it a couple of times as well. One thing that, since you've come on, Judd and I were also talking about the big storylines we didn't even mention with you, is like new head coach, the culture. Like, there's just so much with this team, which makes our job as reporters really exciting. Like, I'm very excited for training camp. I'm really excited to see the intensity. I missed it last year, but of course I was up and aware, and after the season was over, people talked about how it just wasn't the training camp that you should have preparing for a National Hockey League season and having a good season with all the question marks and the intensity and all that. So this is going to be really good, and especially guys fighting for roster spots, which, let's be clear, in your article, I just want to address that because it just came out, but in your article, Jeremy Swayman's not fighting for the roster spot. He's the number one, but there are two guys now that are going to be competing for that official backup spot, or if you want to call it the 1B. This is definitely more of like a backup role when Jeremy Swayman's number one. But tell us what you learned about DiPietro. Tell us what you learned about DiPietro, who's 26 years old, so he's not super young, and is really, like, this might be his chance to really establish himself in the NHL, and I bet he's not sleeping on it.
Yeah, well, he's got a 2-year deal, which is, one-way deal, which is good for him. It's going to be interesting to see, how much time he's able to get in preseason. There are only 6 games. I know that people complain about how many preseason games there were, but this is a season where the Bruins could probably use one more of those because there are a lot of guys that you want to take a look at, like the Blumel kid that David Pastrnak basically recruited to come into the organization. But this is he's an interesting guy, and if he has a good training camp, and Korpisalo has a good training camp, who do you look to trade, and who has more value? Because 3 goalies just don't work, and if you send, I would bet you could get Korpisalo through waivers, but I'm not sure you can get the DiPietro through waivers because he's only making $800,000 and Korpisalo is at 3 something. So I think you could get Korpisalo through waivers, but I don't think you can get DiPietro through it unless he has a really bad camp. Then maybe teams don't bite on that. But it's an interesting situation for the team.
Let's play that forward though. Let's say that they send Korpisalo on to waivers or make him available in a deal. What sort of value does he have based on the time of year that we're going to be talking about? Because you would probably attempt to send him down sometime between the middle of September and the start of the National Hockey League season, which is October 8th. That's also a time where NHL teams will try and sneak players down into the minors and take a gamble that everybody likes what they have, or maybe they're up against the cap and they can't necessarily make a move. But what type of value does a guy like Korpisalo have in late September, early October?
I'm not sure he has a lot, but there's a team in Edmonton that has just about everything, but the goaltender, and they've only got about $3 million, allotted to the goaltending position. So if I'm Edmonton, I take a chance on somebody. So, what they're willing to give up, who knows? Maybe they just wait and hope they put one of those guys on waivers and they snatch him up.
If that does happen and there's trade bait and this could happen for the Bruins, I guess we'll have to see. This may be an easier question to answer after training camp, but if things were perfect and you had your way, like, what position are you filling in that trade? If you could get exactly what you needed, what position would you be looking for in that trade for a goalie?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you'd get a number 1 center. I think they're still looking for a number 1 center. I think they hope they have it in the future with James Hagens, but I would imagine he's going back to BC. That would be the smart move, I think. But I'd be happy to get a top 6 wing. I'm not sure if they can get it, but that would be something they can certainly use.
I'd be very interested, and I haven't had this conversation. I don't know if you have, how much contact they had with a guy like Nikolai Ehlers before he ultimately signed in Carolina. I think that was one of the guys who you could have targeted that would have helped in a number of different ways. Left shot, top 6 player, winger, speedy, skilled. So I'm guessing that one of the guys that you're talking about would be someone analogous to a guy like Nikolai Ehlers, and whether or not the Bruins are going to try and, if they can make a deal to upgrade themselves down the middle. I guess when you were talking about that a little bit, the name that popped into my head is how do you project training camp and the start of the season playing out for a guy like Casey Middlestat, who was essentially acquired to be a guy who could play in your top 6 down the middle? Not necessarily number 1 center, so maybe at best a number 2 center. How does he project, and what is the story around him coming into his first full season as a Bruin?
Yeah, that's where he's slotted right now as second line center. But I've heard Marco Sturm say, maybe he's a wing. So I don't think they're completely sold on Middlestat as the number 2 center. It's going to be very interesting to see what becomes of him if he becomes available in a trade. If they decide to move him for somebody, if they look at, say, a Matt Poitras or even a Fraser Minton and say this kid is something more than we thought he was, and they make Mittelstadt available for maybe a wing or whatever. But it's going to be interesting because, like I said, I don't think they're completely sold on him being the number 2 center.
Steve, just to pivot a little bit, I was just thinking about it as you were answering that question. I joined the Bruins in 2019. We all know the success they've had since then, and in terms of regular season, excuse me. For me, in my short time, 6 years, this is like the most question marks I've had around training camp. But I was just thinking for you and your coverage, when was the last time you felt this way about a team of like, it could go so either way? Like there's so many directions. And it's so unpredictable in terms of who's going to make the roster. Performance-wise, is Morgan Geekie going to be as good as he was last year? XYZ. When was the last time you felt like the Bruins had a similar training camp with all these question marks, if you can remember?
It may go back to when the year that they put in a lot of rookies. The year they with DeBrusk.
2018.
Yeah, DeBrusk. Who else? McAvoy was coming back for his first full year. He played in the playoffs the year before. Corrali, they were bringing up. So
Grzelcyk, Heinen.
Yes, all those guys. So that was a year where you were really concerned about where they were going. But they also still had Chara. They still had Bergeron. They still had Krejci. This one is a little different. You know, I wouldn't be trading their number 1 draft pick if I was them at this point.
Yeah, I would think, when it comes to Hagens, because, I know, Sophia, you had brought him up, even before the segment that we started with Oki, and maybe, Oki, I'd love to get your thoughts as well. I would think best case scenario for a guy like James Hagens is that he plays the full season with Boston College, signs, and then joins you at the tail end of the regular season. But the other thing I think about is even if he's able to do that, and that would certainly be a positive for the Bruins, I guess I'm tempted. You don't want to put so much weight on a player like that coming into an organization to be a savior, because it takes a while to get your foothold, especially as a skill player in the National Hockey League.
Yeah, I mean, Macklin Celebrini might have been the most complete player I've seen come out of college as a teenager and go into an NHL team. And what did he do for the San Jose Sharks? Did he change their fate at all? Not much. No, it takes some time. So yeah, and I don't think, and Hagens did not have the kind of year that a Celebrini had as a freshman. He's a little younger than Celebrini was, but there needs to be some patience here with this kid. He may be his ceiling may be as a number 2 center. Who knows?
Right. And the numbers that I think about, because one of the names that gets associated with a guy like James Hagens is Jack Hughes. Now, Jack, the year that he came out, he was first overall, but his numbers, now remember, he was an 18-year-old, and I'll give you these numbers because it's just an example of how long it can take. So the first year, he comes out as an 18-year-old. 21 points in 61 games. Then at 19, 31 points in 56 games in that shortened season. At 20 years old, that's when it started to kick in for him, when he had 26 goals, 56 points in 49 games for the New Jersey Devils. But there are a lot of guys. I think of a guy like Matty Beniers when he came out, and he was a higher pick coming out of the University of Michigan for Seattle. Had a great, when he came out, I think he had maybe like 9 or 10 points in his first 9 or 10 games in the National Hockey League, won the Rookie of the Year award, and then took a step back for that Seattle team. So I guess where I'm trying to go with here is, listen, I think it's great that the Bruins are able to add a guy like James Hagens to the organization, but it may take a while, and it may require some patience to get there.
Yeah, no question about it. He's... And you go to Jack Hughes, and I think Hagen's just a little bigger than Jack Hughes is, but Jack Hughes has already taken a lot of wear and tear on that body right now. And I would not I would not subject James Higgins to professional hockey at this point in his physical maturing.
Steve, and speaking of maturing, I just want to add in, you obviously had a chance to be there around development camp, but I found him very pleasant, easy to talk to, confident with reporters, and that was nice to see because sometimes it takes a while and is part of the adjustment. But I do want to talk about the youth movement because Judd and I kind of left it on that before we had to send it to break. Like, I'm just so curious to see how Matt Patra, Fabian Lysell, Fraser Minten end up looking. I remember how excited I was in preseason games when we were still trying to figure out if it was patois or whatever, how to pronounce Matthew Patra's name. But, you know, he had these like cerebral plays and these no-look passes, and we were like, oh my God, this is amazing. And then obviously now he had an injury and then took some time to develop. Is this the training camp that, at least for Lysell and Patra, is, I don't want to say make or break, but is this one of the most important ones of their lives?
For Lysell, yes, I definitely think so. He's got an uphill battle right now. He showed some flashes last year when he was able to come up and play, but they were few and far between. He's obviously got some skill. He did make one play that really stood out in my head, and I can't even think again who it was against. But he's got skill. He does not have size. He has a hard time getting into the inside ice. So this is a very important year for Lysell. I'd like to see him, maybe get to Warrior in Brighton, maybe a little earlier in the offseason, sometime in August, but I don't know what his schedule is. And Matt Patra, I think I'd still be pretty patient with him. But he's shown a little more than what Lysell has shown so far. He's got to learn to avoid the big hits and things like that. He's not the fastest guy in the world, so he's got a few things to learn. But I'd still be pretty patient with Patra. But Lysell, it's getting on.
Do you think Patra can play wing?
I don't know. I don't know if he has the size to do it. I would think he probably can. It's, usually centermen, they're centers because they were always the best player on all their teams growing up. And there's so many guys, come in as centermen and get moved to the wing. Like Phil Kessel, he came in as a centerman. He was quickly moved to the wing. So yeah, I think he could probably play it. He's got to learn to maybe take a hit or two from the big defenseman pinching down, but I think he probably could play it.
I think it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out for him, Sophia and Oki. Headed into training camp, where he's slotted. I think Oki make a good point when it comes to Patra because he's a little bit younger. I think that he has a little bit more leeway than a guy like Fabian Lysell, even though the age difference isn't dramatic. But I think just based on the experience that Lysell has had playing some pro hockey, that it's probably about time that he needs to make an impact. And whether or not a guy like Patra can play the wing, if he's able to do it, it's certainly good for the Bruins because it gives him a little bit more versatility. He certainly has the willingness to go win battles along the wall. Whether he's able to stand up to that, that's another matter. You can certainly do it. That's a skill. Listen, a guy like Mitch Marner is not a big guy, but he was able to figure it out. And there are plenty of guys as an example. You want to use Patrick Kane as an example. Patrick Kane's not the biggest guy. He certainly got stronger over his career. He was never a guy who was slotted as center, by the way. But if he's able to learn that, I think that's good for the Bruins because otherwise, if he's really a centerman, you've got a logjam down the middle. Because if Fraser Minten essentially projects to be a guy like Charlie Coyle, well, that's a third-line center. And maybe a second-line center if the case may be. Okay, so where does Patra fit down the road if that's where you see a guy like Fraser Minten? So those are, I think, when it comes to some of the youth, Sophia and Oki, that we're talking about, those are some of the things that we think about. And there was another quote from Don Sweeney, and I'd love to get your thoughts on that the improvements now have to come from within. Now, I'm sure he's talking about everybody on the roster, but I think when we're having this conversation, it's got to be about some of the young players that are emerging in this organization.
Absolutely. I mean, Minten, I think, is an interesting guy because he seems like a very, smart player. And is he smart enough to maybe play above, the skill level that he has? Patrice Bergeron, probably wouldn't win many foot races if you're going around and around in a circle. But if the race is to the boards to get a puck, he's going to win more than his share, right? So, is he a guy who can think the game better than his opponent? Is he going to find ways to get that puck? And can he, can he play above his various skill levels? I think he's an interesting player. I wouldn't want to put a ceiling on him to say he's just a third line center. I think he's an interesting player.
I think there are a lot. I would agree with you. I can't wait to see a little bit more Fraser Minten. As we started this segment with you, Steve, a lot of interesting storylines, lots of question marks. Would love to have you back on maybe midway through training camp or after, just to kind of answer some of the questions when we get to observe training camp, which starts in, Judd, you did the count, 6 weeks, is it? Something like that?
Maybe about 7 weeks. Middle of September.
Yeah, it's sneaking up on us. But for now, we do have to pay some bills, Steve, so we're going to let you go. We're going to send it to commercial. Thank you for joining us. We'll have you back on again in September. Have a great rest of your summer. Judd, you and I will be back to answer some fan questions. We'll see everyone after this.
Thanks, Sophia. Thanks, Judd.
Welcome back to the Hockey Hub. Sophia and Judd here with you, going over all things Bruins. Obviously, that's what this show's about. It's called Hockey Hub. Judd, we have like 4 minutes, so not that long, but we want to get to fan question and comments. I'm kind of going to combine, and I want your thoughts because you are on our show. I'm going to combine two. I'm going to read a comment, and then there's a question in there in another from another fan. But this one coming from Brian Bergie on Tanner Jeannot's contract. He says Tanner Jeannot is a Marco Sturm guy, and there were over 10 teams who wanted him in their locker room. What if the cap hit was $2.9 million? Would that make things more palatable? Sweeney has knocked it out of the park since the deadline. I trust their judgment. So that's a comment about Jeannot, and I want your thoughts on this because we have B Bruins 88 who says, I was talking about the wing for the Bruins. I would slot in Jeannot, Minten, and Lysell on wing. Minten and Lysell on wing. Personally, I like Tanner. I think he can excel with some offensive talent around him, and he can protect the young talent so they can do their thing without intimidation. So instead of posing a general or a specific question, let's just get your thoughts on Jeannot and what these two fans are talking about in this acquisition. What did you make of it?
Well, let's first talk about, I think that he brings up a great point when it comes to the contract. I think a lot of times when we look at players, we look at them through the lens of their contract. How much money are they making? How long are they signed for? And I think for a lot of people, and even some former Kings people that I talked to, I think that they were surprised, maybe not necessarily with the amount of money that he was making, but how long the contract was. And I think for a lot of people, when it came to a guy like David Krejci, I think they were also surprised about the amount of money that he was making. But I don't think there's any question that you got the value that you wanted out of a guy like David Krejci based on the number. As far as Jeannot and how much he can help, he's going to make everybody a lot taller. He's going to give some of those young players more room and time out there on the ice. But I think what remains to be seen is, can he move up from a fourth line spot, which was essentially where he was with the Kings. I think they tried to move him up unsuccessfully. I think Tampa tried to do the same. Can he somehow recapture some of his offensive success that he had early in his career? If he's able to do that, then the Bruins have a value signing.
Yeah, excellent points there. And honestly, I'm going to throw one more at you because you nailed that and you wrapped it up really quickly. Just give us your thoughts on Nikita Zadorov. Scott Morrissey, 89-15, talked about his career high plus-minus, plus 25. He was on the ice for just 76 of 271 goals the Bruins gave up. And, he had a lot of criticism. So he's defending him here, saying, like, yeah, right, that's not a bad, that doesn't seem like a bad year. I joined late. And I'm not using that as an excuse, but I got to know him in the room, and he definitely has a big personality. That's what I took away from most of it. But what did you make of his year and his upside for this coming season? So
I think Zadorov, and yes, he is a big personality within the room and certainly on the ice. I think it took him a while to find his space with the team. And to find out exactly where he was slotted. And then all of a sudden you experienced all sorts of injuries, and then you experienced even more changes at the trade deadline. So that changed things around. He should have a more consistent partner this year, assuming that there's health. I think that there's a greater understanding of what his role is and what's expected, assuming that Hampus Lindholm is going to come back and play the way that the Bruins are hoping that he plays. He's going to be slotted in a very different way than he was at times, certainly in the second half of the season. He was a consistent performer. And I don't think that the Bruins, especially because you bring in, just to dovetail back to Tanner Jeannot, I don't think the Bruins need him to be a guy who's out there looking for a scrap every night. I think they want him to be a nasty presence on the blue line. And if the opportunity presents itself, then he needs to make his presence felt. But I think for him, it took him a while to find his niche. I think that he'll be able to deepen that niche once this season starts.
Totally agree. Year 2 is going to be a lot better for him than year 1, in my opinion. Judd, one more commercial break. We're going to be back to wrap up the show. We're talking swag, Bruin swag, or NESN swag after this. Welcome back to the show and goodbye, because we've got 20 seconds. Judd, thanks for being on. I just wanted to promote, we've got NESN swag. We've got the Hockey Hub podcast swag that you guys can now get and wear. Just go to NESNWickedWearables.com. T-shirts, not just for this podcast, but all the ones we have on this show. Judd, I'm sure we'll be talking to you again soon. Thanks for being on our show, everybody, or you and everybody. We'll see you on Wednesday at 10 a.m. for another episode. Have a great one, Judd.
See you, Soph.
See ya.